The year was 1856, and the climate along the northern Florida coast was heavy enough to crush the soul. It was a terrain of extremes, where the damp, salt air off the Atlantic collided with the stagnant decay of the swamplands, weaving a suffocating shroud over the land. Here, the boundary between the earth and the water was porous, fluctuating with the tides, much like the unstable balance of power that held the territory together. On the lonely stretch of soil known as the Whitmore Estate, the stillness of the night was typically total, save for the rhythmic buzz of cicadas or the distant lonely cry of a heron. But on this particular night, the silence in the slave quarters was filled with a kinetic intensity, a static charge that made the hair on one's arm rise. In a cabin that leaned dangerously against the breeze, a child was being born who would dismantle the very logic of her existence. If you are drawn to the hidden chronicles of defiance and the legends that emerged from the soil of American grief, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you are viewing from. These stories are a shared legacy, and we're glad you're here to witness this one. The midwife overseeing the birth was a woman named Rue, an elder whose gnarled hands held the medicinal and spiritual wisdom of 3 generations. She sensed immediately that this was no ordinary arrival. The moon was entirely missing from the sky, a deep and heavy gloom. Yet the single tallow candle Rue had brought refused to sustain a flame. 3 times she struck flint to steel, and 3 times a draught that appeared from nowhere, a breath of cold air in the sweltering room, snuffed it out. Resigned to the shadows, Rue worked by touch and intuition, her fingers reading the mother's contractions like braille. When the infant finally slipped into the world, there was no wail, no gasping protest against the cool air. The child simply opened her eyes. Even in the darkness, Rue could see them. They were unsettlingly vivid, possessing irises scattered with specks of gold that seemed to catch a light that didn't exist in the room. The baby stared at the midwife with a calm, terrifying depth, an ancient awareness that stopped Rue's breath in her throat. This was not a blank slate. This was a soul that had arrived with its bags already packed. Celia, the mother, was only 22, yet her body was a testament to the savage mathematics of the plantation system. She had been working in the Whitmore cotton field since she was 6, her skin weathered by the relentless sun and her back mapped with the raised scars of the overseer's lash. She had been treated not as a human being, but as a biological resource, her existence recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and crop totals. This child was the result of a forced union, a cold calculation by the Whitmore family to expand their stock by breeding Celia with a man from a neighboring estate, a man she barely knew and never encountered again. But as Celia took the silent infant into her arms, the crushing weight of her reality fractured. Looking down at the girl, whose skin was a deep, radiant obsidian that seemed to absorb the shadows, Celia felt the sudden, violent intrusion of hope. Why, it was a hazardous emotion, perhaps the most dangerous thing a person could possess, in a place designed to extinguish it. She named the girl Zora after a grandmother who had been stolen from the Gold Coast, and who had died whispering of a place where her people commanded the iron and the earth, answering to no master but the heavens. That grandmother had been a practitioner of what the masters fearfully called witchcraft, and what the community knew as root work or hoodoo, a complex spiritual technology of survival, healing, and defense transported across the Middle Passage in the minds of the captive. Rue remembered Celia's grandmother well. She had been a woman who could turn the wind with a whisper and cure fevers with weeds that grew by the path. Rue saw that same dormant voltage in the newborn Zora. It was an inheritance of power that had skipped a generation, lying quiet in Celia, only to erupt in her daughter. As Zora grew, this difference became impossible to disregard. She did not learn the lessons of submission that were beaten into the other children. She did not lower her gaze when white people passed. She did not shrink to make herself invisible. Instead, she walked with her chin lifted, moving through the quarters with the regal bearing of a displaced queen. By the time she was a toddler, the enslaved community watched her with a mixture of protective love and deep anxiety, knowing that such a spirit was usually broken quickly and violently by the machinery of the plantation. The first true manifestation of her nature occurred when Zora was just 2 years old. She had wandered away from the supervision of the older children and found her way into the main plantation house, a forbidden zone where the penalty for trespassing was severe. She was found in the parlor sitting on the bench of the grand piano, but she wasn't banging on the keys like a toddler. She was pressing them with deliberate, eerie precision, producing a haunting, dissonant melody that sounded like weeping. The overseer, a sadist named Garrett, who prided himself on his ability to break the spirit of the enslaved, found her there. Garrett was a man of leather and grit, his humanity long ago eroded by the brutality of his trade. He reached for the heavy, coiled whip at his belt, intending to teach the child a permanent lesson about boundaries. "Got to cut the rot out early," he had sneered, raising his arm to strike. But the blow never landed. Witnesses, house slaves peering from the hallway, later whispered that as Garrett raised his arm, Zora stopped playing and simply turned to look at him with those amber-flecked eyes. In that instant, the overseer gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been struck by a sledgehammer. His face drained of color, turning a sickly ash-gray. He staggered back, dropping the whip, his eyes bulging as he fought for air against an invisible constriction, as though iron bands were being tightened around his ribs by a ghostly hand. He collapsed to one knee, wheezing, overwhelmed by a sensation of pure, primal dread that had no physical source. The moment he crawled backward, breaking eye contact with the toddler, the pain vanished, leaving him trembling and soaked in a cold sweat. Garrett never spoke of what he saw in the child's eyes, but he never raised a hand against Zora again. He avoided her with a superstitious terror, crossing the road if he saw her approaching, a reaction that did not go unnoticed by T. He rest of the plantation. Years passed, and the legend of the girl grew in the quiet whispers of the quarters. Zora was 5 when Celia began to secretly plot their escape, driven by the realization that her daughter's supernatural tether would eventually be seen not as a curiosity, but as a threat that had to be eliminated. The plantation was a place of stagnant misery, but around Zora the laws of nature seemed pliable. Vicious tracking dogs trained to tear human flesh would whimper and roll over on their bellies when she passed. Padlocks on the food stores would click open when she lingered near them, allowing the starving field hands to steal scraps of pork during the lean winter months. Rue, recognizing that the girl needed guidance to control this volatile gift, began to train her in the old ways. Under the cover of the pre-dawn mist deep in the woods, Rue taught Zora the language of the earth, which roots could stop a heart and which could mend it, how to read the warnings written in the flight of crows, and how to craft mojo bags for protection. But the most important lesson Rue taught her was psychological, that the chains were forged of iron, but the power of the master was a construct, an illusion that could be dismantled by a stronger will. By the autumn of 1861, the world outside the plantation was burning. The Civil War had erupted, tearing the nation apart, and the structure of the plantation began to fray. The master's sons rode off in gray uniforms to fight for the Confederacy, leaving the estate underguarded and chaotic. However, the fear of insurrection led to tighter patrols and swifter executions for runaways. The tension was palpable. The air smelled of impending violence. Zora, now 10 years old, was hovering on the precipice of womanhood, a dangerous time for any enslaved girl. Garrett, the overseer, had begun watching her again, not with the old fear, but with a new predatory glint in his eyes, a calculating look that Celia recognized with sickening clarity. She knew they were running out of time, but the final push came from Zora herself. For 3 consecutive nights, the girl woke screaming from a vision. She saw men with lanterns, the glint of shackles and blood soaking the soil of the quarters. On the 3rd morning, she looked at her mother, her face grave and ancient. "We have to go tonight," Zora said, her voice carrying the weight of a prophecy. "If we stay, we don't wake up." Celia trusted the girl's sight more than she trusted her own fears. That day they prepared in silence. They possessed almost nothing, but they gathered what mattered. A small sack of cornmeal Celia had been hoarding grain by grain, a stolen kitchen knife sharpened to a razor's edge, and a leather pouch prepared by Rue. The old midwife pressed the bag into Zora's hands with a fierce, trembling grip. Inside were the tools of their survival: High John the Conqueror root, graveyard dirt, and a slip of paper inscribed with symbols that Rue's own grandmother had drawn from memory of the old country. "You are not what they say you are," Rue whispered, her eyes wet. "The world is wide, and you have the power to walk through it. Don't let them catch you, child. Make them afraid." As the moon vanished behind a bank of heavy clouds, plunging the world into a protective darkness, Celia and Zora slipped out of the cabin. They did not head north, as was the custom for runaways, but east toward the vast, untamed expanse of the marshes and the sea. Stepping off the edge of the known world and into the labyrinth of the unknown, they moved initially toward the St. John's River, a vast, dark artery of water that cut through the heart of the landscape. It was a counterintuitive choice. The North Star beckoned them toward the Georgia line and the distant promise of Union territory, but Zora had insisted on the water. "The river has a mouth that doesn't speak," she had whispered to her mother, her small hand gripping Celia's callous palm with surprising strength. They waded into the current just as the first grey dilution of night began to suggest the coming dawn. The water was cool and murky, thick with silt and the unseen movement of river creatures. To Celia, every submerged log felt like an alligator, every splash a patrol boat. But Zora moved with her eerie calm, her head above the surface like a swimming otter, navigating the currents as if she had a map etched into her mind. They let the river carry them downstream, drifting with the flow to conserve energy, their feet only occasionally brushing the soft, sucking mud of the riverbed. If you're rooting for Zora and Celia to make it through the impossible, hit that like button to send them some strength. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Back at the plantation, the alarm was raised with the rising sun, though it came later than it should have. Old Isaiah, the keeper of the bell that summoned the enslaved to the fields, had noticed the empty cabin and the missing women before the first light hit the cotton rows. Isaiah was nearly 70, a man whose spirit had been ground down by decades of bondage. Yet he remembered the way Zora had once looked at him, a look that made him feel like a man rather than a mule. In a quiet act of treason that could have cost him his life, Isaiah delayed ringing the bell. He fumbled with the rope, feigned a coughing fit, and wasted a precious hour of the morning. That single hour was a gift of distance, a gap between the fugitives and the hounds that would prove crucial. By the time the overseer Garrett realized the absence and the plantation erupted into chaos, Celia and Zora had already vanished into the tree line where the river fed into the coastal marshlands. The Whitmores did not rely on local patrols for this. The escape of a field hand was a nuisance. The escape of the girl, whom they had begun to view with a mixture of covetousness and superstitious dread, was a crisis. They sent for Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw was not a mere slave patroller. He was a specialist, a man whose name was whispered with fear across 3 states. He was a professional hunter of human beings, a mercenary who had turned the tracking of runaways into a grim science. He arrived at the plantation just before noon, riding a massive roan gelding and trailing a pack of 6 Cuban bloodhounds, beasts bred for aggression and stamina, with ears that dragged the ground and noses that could pull a scent out of a rainstorm. Crenshaw was a terrifying figure. Tall, gaunt, and dressed in drab oilskin that shed water and mud. His face was like a cliffside, craggy and immovable, with pale grey eyes that possessed the dead-flat effect of a shark. He carried a customized rifle, a coil of heavy rope and a set of iron shackles that jingled softly against his saddle, a sound that was the music of nightmares for the enslaved population of the region. Crenshaw wasted no time with pleasantries. He listened to Garrett's blustering report with bored detachment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "How long?" was all he asked, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. When told it had been nearly 8 hours, he didn't blink. He had caught men with a 3-day head start. He dismounted and entered the cabin where Celia and Zora had lived, moving with a predator's economy. He picked up a rag doll Zora had left behind, bringing it to his nose, then offered it to the lead hound, a massive brute named Titus. The dog inhaled the scent deeply, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but then did something Crenshaw had never seen. It sneezed violently and backed away, whining, rubbing its snout against the dirt floor as if trying to scrub the smell out. Crenshaw frowned, a flicker of unease passing through him. He forced the dog back to the scent, kicking it in the ribs until it complied. "Smart runaways go to water," he muttered to Garrett. "But water only hides you for so long. Eventually, you have to come up for air, and you have to touch ground." The hunt began in earnest. The party consisted of Crenshaw, his pack of hounds, and 2 hired guns, hard men named Boggs and Doyle, who were eager for the bounty money. They picked up the trail at the riverbank where the footprints entered the mud. "They went in here," Crenshaw noted, pointing to the slide marks. "Woman and a child. They'll be slow. The current is pushing south. We ride the bank." He was confident, operating on years of experience and the certainty of his own superiority. But as they rode, following the river's winding course, the trail didn't behave as it should. Usually, runaways would exit the water within a mile or two, desperate to get out of the cold and the exposure. But miles passed, and there was no sign of them emerging. It was as if the river had simply swallowed them whole. It wasn't until late afternoon that the dogs finally struck a scent again, miles downstream, at a place where the river dissolved into the chaotic geography of the salt marshes. Here the ground became a treacherous mix of sawgrass, black water, and hammocks of solid earth, a labyrinth designed to kill the uninitiated. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, the terrain turned hostile. The horses struggled in the muck, sinking to their fetlocks. Their breathing labored in the humid air. The sawgrass was tall enough to hide a man on horseback, and it sliced at their clothes and skin. This was the borderland, a place where civilization ended and the primal ancient world began. Crenshaw felt a creeping irritation. The trail they had found was clear, footprints leading deep into the swamp, but it felt too clear, almost inviting. The dogs were agitated, their behavior erratic. They would bay excitedly at a patch of reeds, only to find nothing or cower from a shadow that held no danger. Titus, the lead dog, kept stopping to look back at the trees they had passed, his hackles raised, growling at the empty air. "Something's wrong with these mutts," Boggs complained, swatting a mosquito the size of a coin. "Heat's getting to him." Crenshaw said nothing, but his grip on the reins tightened. It wasn't the heat. He knew dogs. He knew fear. And his dogs were terrified. Miles ahead, in the deepening gloom of the swamp, Celia was nearing the end of her endurance. Her legs were numb from the cold water, her skirt heavy with mud, her feet cut and bleeding. But Zora pulled her onward, relentless. The girl seemed to draw energy from the swamp itself, her eyes glowing brighter as the daylight faded. They reached a small, elevated island, a hammock dominated by a massive, twisting live oak tree draped in Spanish moss that looked like the grey beards of wizards. "Here," Zora said, her voice small but commanding. "We rest here." Celia collapsed onto the root structure of the tree, shivering uncontrollably. "They're coming, baby." She wept, the terror she had suppressed all day finally breaking through. "I can hear the dogs. That man, Crenshaw, he never stops." Zora knelt beside her mother, taking the pouch Rue had given her from her dress. She began to pull out the items, the roots, the bones, the paper with the symbols. "He'll stop," Zora said, her tone devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, glittering purpose. "He thinks he's hunting us, Mama, but tonight the swamp is going to hunt him." As night fell, absolute and suffocating, the hunters made camp on a strip of dry land 2 miles back. They were frustrated, muddy, and on edge. The swamp was noisy with the sounds of night, the croaking of bullfrogs, the splash of gars, the screech of owls. But underneath the noise lay a heavy, watchful silence. Crenshaw sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press against the circle of light. He was a man of logic, of bullets and blood. But the atmosphere here felt charged with something he couldn't name. Suddenly the fire, which had been burning brightly, hissed and died, plunging them into total blackness. There was no wind, no rain. It was as if the oxygen had simply been withdrawn from the air. In the sudden dark, Doyle screamed. "Something touched me," he yelled, scrabbling for a match. When the flare of the Lucifer finally illuminated the camp again, they were alone, but on the ground in the center of their camp lay a perfect circle of white stones that hadn't been there a moment before. And in the middle of the stones sat a small crude doll made of marsh grass, its head twisted backward, staring directly at Silas Crenshaw. The silence that followed the discovery of the grass doll was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered even the bravado of hired guns. Doyle stared at the small, twisted figure sitting in the center of the white stones, his eyes wide and rimmed with the white-hot panic of a man whose worldview is collapsing. The doll wasn't just a crude effigy. It was a message bound with human hair and smelling faintly of grave dirt and ozone. Crenshaw, shaking off the momentary paralysis that had gripped the camp, kicked the doll into the darkness with a snarl of disgust. "It's a trick," he barked, his voice ragged but loud enough to shatter the quiet. "Just superstition meant to scare weak-minded fools. They're watching us, trying to spook us, because they know they can't outrun us." But even as he spoke, relighting the fire with a furious striking of flint, he felt the lie of his own words. The air around them had grown inexplicably cold, a wet, seeping chill that ignored their coats and settled deep in the marrow of their bones. If you're wondering just how far Zora's powers can reach, or if you believe in the old stories of root work protecting the vulnerable, drop a comment below. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community of history seekers. Sleep was a fugitive that night. The men took shifts watching the perimeter, backs to the fire, rifles leveled at the wall of black sawgrass that surrounded them. But the darkness was not empty. Throughout the night, the sounds of the marsh shifted from the natural to the impossible. They heard the crying of a baby, distinct, heartbreaking, and human, coming from the center of a deep water channel where no child could be. Then came the sound of chains, the heavy, rhythmic clanking of iron shackles dragging through mud, circling the camp, moving closer, then receding, then returning. The dogs, usually the most reliable sentinels, were useless. They huddled together in a shivering mass, whining piteously, refusing to look out into the dark. At one point, Titus, the massive lead hound, stood up and stared at an empty patch of ground, his tail tucked, and let out a howl that sounded less like a dog and more like a man screaming in agony. It was a sound that made Boggs cross himself and mutter prayers he hadn't said since childhood. Miles away on the hammock beneath the ancient oak, Zora was awake. She sat cross-legged on the earth, her small hands moving over a collection of objects arranged in a precise geometry. A bird's skull, a piece of pyrite, dried sage, and a lock of hair she had snagged from a bramble earlier that day. Her eyes were open but unseeing, the amber flecks swirling like nebulae. She was exhausted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air, a trickle of blood leaking from her left nostril. Celia watched her daughter with a terrifying mixture of pride and helplessness. She wanted to snatch Zora up to tell her to stop, to run, but she knew that running was no longer enough. They had to fight. "I'm in their heads, Mama," Zora whispered, her voice sounding raspy and old. "I'm showing them the things they fear most. I'm making the water look like blood. I'm making the trees look like men with no faces." She slumped forward, the connection breaking, gasping for air as if she'd been underwater. The primary one, the commander. His spirit is solid, like a stone fortification, but I am discovering the fractures. The sun climbed on the second day, yet it offered no comfort. The light was faint and sickly, straining through a thick haze that refused to dissipate. The campsite was in shambles. When Crenshaw went to inspect the horses, he found them drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror, as if they had been galloped hard all night despite being restrained. But the true strike came from the hounds. One of the dogs, a savage tracker named Brutus, had vanished. The rope had not been gnawed through, the knot had been carefully untied. It lay on the soil, the complex loops unraveled with human precision. "They were here," Doyle breathed, spinning around, his weapon trembling in his grasp. "They marched right into our camp while we sat here and released the dog. We are going to perish out here, Crenshaw. I am telling you, this is dark work." Crenshaw struck Doyle across the face, a sharp, brutal blow that sent the man into the mud. "Be silent," Crenshaw hissed, his face inches from Doyle's. "We ride. We finish this. No one escapes Silas Crenshaw." They pushed forward, but the marshland seemed to have shifted its own geography overnight. The trail, which had been obvious the day before, was now a bewildering maze of false clues. Footprints would manifest clearly in the muck, leading them into a barrier of thorns, only to disappear without a trace. Marks on trees seemed to change positions when their eyes were turned. The compass needle on Crenshaw's saddle horn rotated lazily, unable to locate north, pulled by some magnetic distortion that defied logic. The heat intensified, suffocating and moist, bringing with it clouds of biting insects that swarmed the eyes and mouths of men and animals alike. And then the hallucinations began. It started with Boggs. He was riding at the rear, trailing the group, when he suddenly pulled his horse in with a shout. There by the cypress, he pointed a trembling finger at a cluster of trees 50 yards away. "I saw her, the girl. She was standing right there observing me." Crenshaw wheeled his horse around, rifle ready, but there was nothing but moss and darkness. "You are seeing ghosts, Boggs," he snapped, though his own heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs, sunstroke and terror. "I saw her," Boggs insisted, his face white and slick with perspiration. "She didn't look right, boss. She was hovering and she was grinning, not like a child grins, but like a wolf." They examined the spot, wading through knee-deep black water. There were no tracks, no broken plants. But carved into the trunk of the cypress tree, fresh and weeping sap, was a sigil, a circle with a cross through it, the ends of the cross hooked like barbs. It was the same emblem that had been on the parchment in Zora's pouch. Crenshaw stared at it, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He recalled it vaguely from stories old slaves used to narrate, a mark of the crossroads, a warning that you were entering a realm where the laws of the living no longer functioned. As the day progressed, the mental collapse of the hunting party quickened. Doyle began to cry silently as he rode, rambling about his mother and transgressions he had committed years ago. Boggs kept glancing over his shoulder, certain that the trees were creeping closer every time he looked away. Even Crenshaw, the man of iron, began to feel the unraveling of his reality. He saw movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that stretched and reached for him, forms in the water that resembled drowning faces. He developed a throbbing headache, a spike of pain behind his eyes that pulsed in synchronization with the cicadas screaming. He realized with a dawning dread that they were being guided. The trail they were following, the subtle signs of snapped twigs and disturbed earth, were not errors made by a frightened mother. They were lures. Zora was leading them deeper into the most hazardous section of the marsh, away from firm ground, into a place where the horses would be useless and the heavy men would be hindered. By late afternoon, the environment had become a nightmare. The water was waist-deep in spots, black and foul-smelling. The horses were panicking, struggling against the reins, terrified of the things brushing against their legs beneath the surface. They reached a dead end, a vast stretch of open, stagnant water enclosed by a wall of impenetrable cypress knees. There was no way forward, and when they turned to retreat, the path they had forged seemed to have vanished, the sawgrass knitting itself together to seal their exit. They were cornered, and then from every direction and nowhere a sound commenced. It was a low resonance, a vibration that rattled their teeth. It grew louder, layering upon itself a choir of voices, humming an old, sorrowful spiritual. Wade in the water, children. The sound did not originate from human throats. It came from the wind, the water, the trees. The dogs went wild, howling and snapping at the air. Suddenly, the water in the center of the clearing began to boil. Bubbles rose to the top, bursting with the scent of sulfur and decay. The horses reared, throwing the men into the slime. Crenshaw scrambled to his feet, water pouring into his boots, his rifle held high. "Show yourself," he screamed, his voice breaking, sounding insignificant against the vastness of the swamp. "Come out and confront me." And then she did. Or at least, a vision of her appeared. 50 yards away, standing on the surface of the water, as if it were polished obsidian, was Zora. She was not the tattered runaway child anymore. In the vision, she was 10 feet tall, her skin made of the midnight sky, her eyes 2 burning spheres of amber fire. She did not speak, but her voice resonated in their skulls like a telepathic thunderclap. "You are not the hunters here," the voice roared, vibrating in their very marrow. "You are the intruders, and the swamp is famished." Boggs snapped first. With a shriek of absolute madness, he dropped his weapon and fled blindly into the brush, ignored the thorns shredding his face. Doyle fell to his knees in the water, weeping, clutching his rosary, paralyzed by the divine horror of the sight. Crenshaw alone remained upright, though his legs shook violently. He raised his rifle, aiming at the giant spectral child. "I am Silas Crenshaw," he bellowed, a desperate claim of identity against the abyss. "I do not fear spirits." He pulled the trigger. The gun fired, a flash of sparks and smoke, but the lead passed harmlessly through the image, rippling it like a reflection in a disturbed pool. The giant Zora threw her head back and laughed, a sound of crashing tides and breaking timber, and the water around Crenshaw suddenly erupted, pulling him down into the dark. Silas Crenshaw broke the surface of the black water, gasping for air that tasted of brimstone and ancient rot. The spectral giants had disappeared, dissolving into the mist, but the terror she had announced was only beginning to settle. The swamp was no longer a passive setting of water and timber. It had become a hostile, thinking entity. The water around him didn't just move, it grasped. Roots beneath the surface felt like skeletal fingers clutching at his boots, trying to pull him back down into the sediment. He scrambled toward the nearest mound of solid ground, his movements frantic and clumsy, stripping him of the predatory poise he had mastered over decades. His rifle was gone, lost to the mud, and with it went his primary illusion of power. He was a man defined by his ability to rule through strength, and he had just been disarmed by a 10-year-old girl's vision. As he hauled himself onto the mud, trembling fiercely, he realized that the silence of the swamp had returned, but it was the silence of a held breath, the pause before the final judgment. Doyle was gone. The Irishman had fled into the tangled darkness, his mind destroyed by the vision on the water. Boggs was somewhere nearby, whimpering in the sawgrass, curled into a ball, broken by a fear that no sum of money could heal. Crenshaw was effectively alone. He tried to stand to reclaim his authority over the empty air, but his legs refused to support him. Then the fog began to solidify. It didn't just drift in, it formed shapes from the dark voids between the cypress trees, from the heavy veils of Spanish moss, and rising from the water itself, figures began to manifest. They were not solid, yet they obscured the dim light. They were grey and translucent, made of mist and memory. At first, Crenshaw tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by swamp gas and fatigue. But as they drifted closer, the details became undeniable. He saw the tattered clothes of field hands. He saw the iron collars. He saw the scars that mapped the history of the South's cruelty on their ghostly skin. These were not random spirits, they were the lost. They were the men and women who had died in these marshes attempting to escape, the ones Crenshaw and men like him had tracked down, or the ones who had simply vanished into the mud to avoid the lash. Zora hadn't just conjured a phantom, she had opened a doorway. She had turned the marsh into a witness stand. The figures moved with a terrifying, silent slowness, gliding over the water without disturbing a ripple. There were dozens of them, a silent army of the aggrieved, their eyes hollow pits that seemed to drain the light from the world. They didn't scream or strike, they simply watched, but their gaze was a physical weight pressing down on Crenshaw's chest, forcing him to face the magnitude of his own crimes. He retreated, his boots sliding in the mud until his back hit the rough bark of a tree. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice a broken wreck. "I was just doing a job. It's the law." The plea hung in the air, pathetic and hollow, instantly swallowed by the judgment of the dead. Miles away, the source of this nightmare was collapsing. Zora let out a sharp cry and slumped forward, the link to the spirit world severing suddenly. She fell into Celia's arms, her body limp and burning with fever. The effort of summoning the shadows, of pulling the psychic pain of the land into physical form, had nearly taken her life. Blood ran freely from her nose now, staining her worn dress, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. I made them remember," Zora whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "I gave the ghosts a shape so he could see them. But they're heavy, Mama. They're so heavy." Celia held her daughter tightly, rocking her back and forth, terror and awe fighting in her heart. She looked out into the darkness, knowing that somewhere miles away, a cruel man was facing a hell of his own creation. "You rest now, baby," Celia soothed, brushing the damp hair from Zora's forehead. "You did enough. You did more than enough. The swamp has him now." Back in the clearing, the psychological destruction of Silas Crenshaw was complete. One of the figures, a tall man with shackles on his wrists, drifted closer than the rest. He extended a hand not to strike, but as if to offer an invitation. The sound of rattling chains filled Crenshaw's head, deafening and rhythmic, drowning out his own pulse. The logic that Crenshaw valued, the belief in a world of master and slave, of order and property, shattered. He realized with a devastating clarity that he was the anomaly here in the wild, ancient justice of the earth. He was the offender. The fear that seized him wasn't just the fear of death, it was the fear of damnation. He screamed, a roar, a primal sound that tore his throat, and scrambled away from the figure, plunging blindly into the swamp. He didn't know where he was headed, he didn't care, he just ran. He ran until his lungs burned like fire and his muscles failed. He tore through briar patches that shredded his clothes and skin. He waded through water teeming with snakes, heedless of the danger. He was no longer a hunter, he was prey. Chased not by dogs, but by the weight of a history he had helped maintain. Every shadow looked like a judge. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a verdict. He ran through the night, a madman in a ruined kingdom, until he collapsed on a small rise of land miles from where he had started. Utterly destroyed, he curled up in the mud, covering his head with his arms, shaking uncontrollably. Silas Crenshaw, the man who had never lost a trail, was lost. He would eventually crawl out of that swamp 3 days later, half-starved, his hair turned stark white, babbling about judgment and eyes in the gloom. He would never hold a weapon again. He would never hunt another human being. The legend of the girl who broke the slave catcher would spread from cabin to cabin. But the truth was simpler. She hadn't broken him. She had simply forced him to look in the mirror. With the immediate threat neutralized, the urgency of the moment shifted from combat to survival. The sun rose on the 3rd day, finding Celia and Zora miles to the northwest, moving slowly. Zora was weak, barely able to walk, her steps faltering. Celia supported her, becoming the strength for both of them. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, replaced by the grinding reality of their situation. They were exhausted, starving and still deep in enemy territory. But the air felt different now. The oppressive weight of pursuit was gone. The birds were singing again. The swamp, which had been a weapon the night before, returned to being just a place, a difficult, dangerous, beautiful place. "We keep moving," Celia whispered to her daughter and to herself. "We walk until we see blue uniforms. We walk until we're free." They left the marshlands behind, transitioning into the pine forests and red clay hills of southern Georgia, moving toward a destiny that was no longer written by their masters, but by their own weary feet. The journey out of the Florida marshlands and toward the theoretical safety of the Union lines was an ordeal that made the terror of the hunt seem almost merciful by comparison. For 18 grueling days, Celia and Zora moved northwest, navigating a landscape that was actively hostile to their existence. The terrain shifted from the sodden, forgiving cover of the swamps to the exposed pine barrens and red clay hills of southern Georgia. Here, the war was not a rumor, but a physical scar on the land. They passed burned-out homesteads, trampled fields where crops had been seized by foraging armies, and roads churned into mud by the passage of heavy artillery. Hunger became their constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened into agony by the third day. They survived on foraging, bitter wild onions, handfuls of unripe berries, and once a rabbit that Zora had seemingly coaxed out of its burrow with a quiet melody, allowing Celia to catch it with her bare hands. The girl's power was changing, evolving from the explosive defensive force she had wielded against Crenshaw into something subtler, a survival instinct that bordered on precognition. During the second week, the danger escalated. The deeper they moved into the contested borderlands, the thicker the Confederate patrols became. On the 11th night, while following the curve of a dry creek bed, they nearly stumbled into a squad of gray-clad soldiers. There was no time to run, no cover to hide behind except a slight depression in the earth beneath an overhang of roots. Celia pressed Zora into the dirt, shielding the girl's body with her own, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The soldiers were so close that Celia could smell the stale tobacco smoke on their clothes and hear the leather creak of their boots. One of the men stopped directly above them, peering down into the shadows of the creek bed. By all laws of physics and light, he should have seen them. But Zora, trembling with exhaustion, was gripping her mother's hand, murmuring a single repetitive syllable. The soldier's gaze passed over them as if they were nothing more than empty air or a pile of dead leaves. He spat into the dust inches from Celia's head and moved on. When they were gone, Zora collapsed, blood trickling from both nostrils, her skin cold to the touch. She had bent the light, or perhaps the soldiers' minds, rendering them invisible in plain sight. 3 days later, they encountered others. It happened in a dense thicket of scrub oak, where Celia had decided to risk a daylight rest. They woke to find 4 faces staring at them. 2 men, a woman named Sarah and a teenage boy named Marcus, runaways from a sugar plantation near Valdosta. The meeting was tense, filled with the instinctive suspicion of the hunted, but it quickly dissolved into a shared, desperate camaraderie. Sarah had heard whispers of them. The clandestine communication network of the enslaved traveled faster than horses. "They talk about a girl," Sarah said, looking at Zora with wide, reverent eyes. "A girl with amber eyes who broke a slave catcher in the swamp. They say she walks with spirits." Zora shrank from the praise, uncomfortable with being a legend when she felt so much like a tired, hungry child. "We're just walking," Zora said softly. "Same as you." But the group stayed close to her, drawn by the palpable energy that hummed around her, sensing that this child was their best chance of making it across the final threshold. The final barrier was the river. It was wide, swollen with recent rains, and the current moved with a muscular violence. On the far bank, illuminated by the ghostly light of a full moon, stood a line of fortifications. Earthworks and wooden palisades cut a jagged silhouette against the sky. The dilemma was agonizing. Were those Union fires or Confederate ones? To cross into the hands of the enemy would mean immediate capture, likely execution, or a return to chains that would be tighter than before. To stay on this side was to starve or be caught by the patrols that were closing in. "Someone has to look," the older man of the group whispered. "Someone has to get close enough to see the uniforms." Zora stepped forward before Celia could stop her. "I'll go," she said. "The water knows me." Despite Celia's terrified protests, the logic was undeniable. Zora could move silently. She could hold her breath longer than any adult. She had a rapport with the natural world that made her the perfect scout. Celia stood on the muddy bank, watching her daughter's small head bob in the dark water until it disappeared into the shadows of the opposite shore. The wait was an eternity, a suspension of time where every second felt like a physical blow. Sarah held Celia's hand, humming a low, tuneless melody to keep the panic at bay. An hour passed, then two. Just as the sky began to bleed into the purple bruise of pre-dawn, Zora returned. She dragged herself out of the water, shivering violently, her lips blue, but her eyes were blazing with a frantic, joyful light. "Blue?" she gasped, her teeth chattering. "They're wearing blue, Mama, and they're like us." Celia didn't understand at first. Like us. "Black men," Zora whispered. "Black men with rifles. It's the 54th Massachusetts. They're soldiers, Mama, real soldiers." The revelation sent a shockwave through the group. The idea of armed black men, uniformed and sanctioned by the government to fight their former masters, was a dream so radical it was hard to comprehend. They crossed at first light. It was a perilous swim, the current fighting them every inch of the way. But the sight of the blue uniforms on the far bank acted as a beacon. As they dragged themselves onto the Union-held shore, dripping and exhausted, they were not met with chains or whips. A sergeant, a tall black man with chevrons on his sleeve and a face etched with the gravity of war, stepped forward. He lowered his rifle and extended a hand to Celia. "Welcome to the United States Army lines," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You are under federal protection. You are free." The word hung in the air, heavy and strange. Free. Celia tried to say something to offer thanks, but her legs gave out and she fell to her knees in the mud, weeping. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, releasing years of accumulated terror and grief. Around her the others were crying too, embracing the soldiers, touching the blue wool of their uniforms as if to verify they were real. If this story of resistance and the impossible journey to freedom moved you, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Drop a comment below. What do you think became of Zora after the war? Your interaction helps keep these histories alive. In the safety of the contraband camp, as they were fed and given dry clothes, the reality of their new life began to settle. Zora sat wrapped in a wool blanket, sipping tin cup coffee, watching the camp bustle with activity. She was no longer the supernatural force of the swamp. She was just a girl again, safe in the shadow of her mother. The soldiers came by to see her, asking shyly if the stories were true, if she really had conjured ghosts to scare off Silas Crenshaw. Zora just smiled, a tired, enigmatic smile, and said nothing. She knew that the legend of the girl who walked with spirits would outgrow her. It would travel through the camps, across the battlefields, and down through the generations. It would become a ghost story for the overseers and a prayer for the enslaved. But for Zora, the magic wasn't in the root work or the visions. The real magic was simply that they were here, sitting on the earth, answering to no one but themselves. Celia looked at her daughter, seeing the amber flecks in her eyes catch the morning sun. The war was far from over. The road ahead would be paved with the bitter struggles of reconstruction, of a nation fighting to define what black freedom actually meant. There would be poverty and hatred and new forms of bondage to resist. But that was a fight for tomorrow. Tonight, they would sleep without listening for the bell. Tonight, they belonged to themselves. The grandmother's prophecy had been fulfilled not by a miracle, but by the relentless, terrifying, beautiful will of a mother and child who refused to break. In the ledger of history, where they had once been written as property, they now wrote their own names in ink that would never fade. They were here. They were alive.